The morning mist clung to the Ardennes forest like a shroud of deception on December 15th, 1944. Private First Class Johnny Martinez of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter wind as he peered through the frost-covered window of his foxhole. The silence was unnervingly quiet for a war zone that had seen months of brutal fighting. Across Western Europe, for weeks, the Allied forces had been lulled into a false sense of security along what they called the Ghost Front, an 85-mile stretch of thinly defended line running through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower and his staff had deemed this sector unlikely for German attack due to its dense forests and difficult terrain. The Americans had positioned only for divisions here, some battle-weary from previous campaigns, others green recruits who had never faced the fury of German steel. Martinez stomped his feet to keep the circulation flowing, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. The weather had been particularly harsh this December, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing and snow beginning to accumulate on the ground. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces across the line were weakened and demoralized. Their capacity for major offensive operations severely diminished after the devastating losses following the Normandy invasion 6 months earlier. What the Allied commanders didn't know was that Adolf Hitler had been secretly massing his reserves for one final, desperate gamble. Operation Watch on the Rhine, later renamed Operation Autumn Mist, represented the Führer's last attempt to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. 3 German armies, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hassel von Manteuffel, the 6th Panzer Army commanded by SS Oberstgruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, and the 7th Army led by General Erich Brandenberger had been quietly moving into position under cover of the harsh winter weather. The German plan was audacious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Hitler envisioned his armored spearheads punching through the American lines, racing northwest to Antwerp while splitting the British and American forces. If successful, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to focus its remaining strength against the advancing Soviet forces in the east. The operation required speed, surprise, and favorable weather to neutralize Allied air superiority. Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment had been feeling uneasy for days. Reports from forward observation posts mentioned increased German patrol activity and strange movements in the forest. Radio intercepts suggested unusual German communications traffic, though nothing concrete enough to warrant major alarm. The veteran officer had learned to trust his instincts during his years of combat, and those instincts were screaming warnings. As night fell on December 15th, Martinez and thousands of other American soldiers settled into their positions, unaware that across the dark forest, over 200,000 German troops were making final preparations for the largest battle on the Western Front since D-Day. Tank engines rumbled quietly in distant assembly areas, artillery pieces were being positioned, and stormtroopers checked their weapons one last time. The stage was set for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West. In less than 12 hours, the relative quiet of the Ardennes would explode into chaos, testing the resolve of young American soldiers against the desperate fury of the Third Reich's final gamble. The harshest winter of the war was about to claim thousands of lives in a battle that would determine the fate of Western Europe. At exactly 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the world exploded. Private Martinez was jolted from an uneasy sleep as the earth beneath his foxhole trembled like a living thing. The German artillery barrage that announced Operation Autumn Mist was unlike anything the Americans had experienced in the Ardennes. Over 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously along the 85-mile front, their shells screaming through the pre-dawn darkness like banshees of war. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, transforming the peaceful forest into a hellscape of splintered trees, cratered earth, and smoke. Communications lines were severed, command posts destroyed, and entire units found themselves isolated and confused. Martinez pressed himself against the frozen earth as shells burst around his position, dirt and debris raining down on his helmet. The carefully planned defensive positions that had seemed so secure just hours before were being systematically demolished by German artillery observers, who had been studying them for weeks. As the barrage lifted at 7 in the morning, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the groaning of wounded men and the crackle of burning timber. Then came a new sound that chilled the blood of every American soldier, the rumble of tank engines and the rhythmic tramp of marching feet. From the mist-shrouded forest emerged the gray-green uniforms of German infantry, advancing in waves, behind massive Tiger and Panther tanks. According to historical accounts documented by the United States Army Center of Military History, the German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. The 5th Panzer Army struck the center of the American line, targeting the green troops of the 106th Infantry Division, while the 6th Panzer Army hammered the northern shoulder. Near Monschau, the 7th Army attacked in the south, aiming to protect the southern flank of the main assault. Colonel Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment found itself directly in the path of General von Manteuffel's armored spearhead. The Americans fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Tank rounds crashed through the thin walls of their defensive positions, while German infantry, many wearing American uniforms captured in previous battles, infiltrated behind the lines to spread confusion and terror. Private Martinez and his squad were among the first to encounter Otto Skorzny's special commandos, English-speaking Germans dressed in American uniforms and equipped with captured vehicles. These infiltrators had been given specific missions to seize key bridges, spread false orders, and generally create chaos behind American lines. The psychological impact was enormous, as American soldiers began to doubt the identity of every unfamiliar face they encountered. The town of St. Vith became a crucial objective for German forces. This transportation hub controlled key road networks that the advancing panzers needed to maintain their momentum toward Antwerp. Major General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th Infantry Division, found his units scattered and his communications disrupted. Entire regiments were cut off, forced to fight as isolated islands of resistance in an ocean of German advances. By noon on December 16th, German armored columns had penetrated up to 6 miles into American positions. In some sectors, the speed of the advance caught Allied commanders completely off guard. General Omar Bradley initially dismissed reports of the attack as merely a local German spoiling attack designed to disrupt planned American offensives. It would take hours before the true scope of Hitler's gamble became apparent to Allied high command. The weather continued to favor the Germans, with heavy clouds preventing Allied aircraft from providing close air support to the beleaguered ground forces. The Luftwaffe, committing its last reserves, managed to achieve temporary air superiority over the battlefield. German fighters strafed American columns attempting to retreat or reinforce, while the advancing panzers pressed their advantage. As darkness fell on the first day of the offensive, German forces had achieved their initial objectives in most sectors. The American line had been broken in multiple places. Thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured, and panic was beginning to spread through rear area units. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with a German victory that reminded the world that the Wehrmacht, though wounded, was still a formidable fighting force capable of shocking the Allies with its resilience and tactical skill. December 18th, 1944 dawned gray and bitter across the Ardennes as German armored spearheads continued their relentless push westward. The small Belgian town of Bastogne, population 4,000, has suddenly become the most important crossroads in Western Europe. 7 major roads converged on this unremarkable market town, making it essential for German supply lines and mobility. Without Bastogne, General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army would be forced to use secondary roads, slowing their advance toward the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division found himself commanding a makeshift garrison of paratroopers, armored units, and artillery as German forces swept around Bastogne like a rising tide. The Screaming Eagles had been rushed to the Ardennes from their rest area near Reims, many soldiers still wearing their summer uniforms and lacking proper winter equipment. They had been told this was a quiet sector where they could recover from their brutal campaign. In Operation Market Garden, Staff Sergeant William Garner of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led his men through the frozen streets of Bastogne as German artillery began to fall on the town. The paratroopers were veterans of Normandy and Holland, but nothing had prepared them for the ferocity of this German assault. Tiger tanks prowled the tree line outside town, while Wehrmacht infantry probed the hastily established defensive perimeter. The encirclement of Bastogne began on December 20th, when German forces cut the last road leading into the town. McAuliffe's garrison was now completely surrounded, outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. and running dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and many soldiers were suffering from frostbite and exposure. Wounded men lay in the town's makeshift aid stations, without adequate medical care. General Heinrich Freiherr von Lowitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, recognized that his advance was being dangerously delayed by the stubborn American defense of Bastogne. Every hour that McAuliffe's men held out was another hour for Allied reinforcements to arrive and German momentum to dissipate. On December 22nd, Lowitz decided to offer the Americans a chance to surrender with honor. The German surrender demand was delivered to the American lines under a white flag. The message, written in formal military language, stated that the German commander was prepared to accept the surrender of the encircled American forces. To avoid needless bloodshed, it gave McAuliffe 2 hours to respond or face complete annihilation. When the German ultimatum was brought to McAuliffe's command post in a basement on the town square, the general's response became legendary. "Nuts," McAuliffe reportedly exclaimed when he read the surrender demand. When his staff suggested that the Germans might not understand American slang, the general refined his official response to the German commander, "Nuts." The American commander, the message was delivered to the waiting German officers, who initially required translation to understand the colorful rejection of their ultimatum. The German response to McAuliffe's defiance was swift and terrible. Artillery bombardments intensified, and German ground attacks resumed with renewed fury. The Luftwaffe committed precious reserves to bomb the surrounded garrison, while Tiger tanks pressed closer to the town's defensive perimeter. American casualties mounted as the paratroopers fought from house to house, street to street. Against overwhelming odds, Medical Captain Jack Pryor worked tirelessly in the basement of the local church, operating on wounded soldiers by candlelight as German shells crashed overhead. Supplies were so short that medics were reusing bandages and operating without anesthesia. The town's water system had been destroyed, forcing defenders to melt snow for drinking water. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, and ammunition was carefully conserved for only the most critical situations. Despite their desperate situation, the morale of the American defenders remained surprisingly high. They understood the strategic importance of their stand and took pride in defying German demands for surrender. Radio communications with the outside world reminded them that General George Smith Patton Jr.'s Third Army was fighting to reach them, driving north through brutal winter conditions to break the siege. As Christmas Eve approached, the fate of Bastogne and perhaps the entire Battle of the Bulge hung in the balance. The small town had become a symbol of American determination and a testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary circumstances. In the harshest winter of the war, the news of the German offensive reached General George Smith Patton Jr. at his Third Army headquarters in Nancy, France, on the afternoon of December 16th. While other Allied commanders struggled to comprehend the scope of Hitler's gamble, Patton immediately grasped both the danger and the opportunity. The Germans had committed their last reserves in a desperate assault that, if defeated, would leave them defenseless. More immediately, thousands of American soldiers were trapped in Bastogne and needed immediate relief. At the emergency conference called by General Omar Bradley in Verdun, on December 19th, Patton made a promise that stunned his fellow commanders. He declared that he could disengage his Third Army from its current operations in the Saar region and attack northward to relieve Bastogne within 72 hours. Eisenhower, initially skeptical, authorized Patton to proceed with what many considered an impossible maneuver. The logistics of Patton's plan were staggering. The Third Army would have to halt its eastward advance, turn 90 degrees north, and redeploy across nearly 100 miles of winter terrain, while maintaining combat effectiveness. This required moving over 133,000 vehicles, including tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trucks, through icy roads and blinding snowstorms. Most military experts considered such a maneuver impossible in winter conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his orders on December 20th. His unit would spearhead the relief effort, fighting through German defensive lines to reach the besieged garrison at Bastogne. Abrams was a tank commander of exceptional skill and aggressive temperament, exactly the kind of leader Patton needed for this desperate mission. Historical records from the National Archives indicate that Patton's staff worked around the clock to coordinate the massive redeployment. Supply officers calculated fuel requirements. Maintenance crews prepared vehicles for winter operations, An intelligence specialist studied German defensive positions along the route to Bastogne. The general himself drove among his units, inspiring soldiers with his presence and his unwavering confidence in their ability to accomplish the impossible. The weather remained brutally cold as the Third Army began its historic turn north. Tank engines struggled to start in sub-zero temperatures, and ice-covered roads caused numerous accidents and delays. Soldiers wrapped chains around tank treads for better traction, while mechanics worked frantically to keep vehicles operational. The advance was slower than Patton had hoped, but it continued relentlessly through December 21st and 22nd. Major Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion led the point element as Abrams tanks approached the German defensive lines south of Bastogne. Intelligence reports indicated strong German positions anchored by anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry. The approach would require a coordinated assault by armor and infantry against prepared positions in broad daylight, exactly the kind of operation that typically resulted in heavy casualties. German resistance was fierce and well coordinated. The Wehrmacht had used the 3 days since surrounding Bastogne to prepare strong defensive positions along all the approach routes. Anti-tank guns concealed in tree lines knocked out several American tanks, while German infantry launched counterattacks against advancing American forces. The fighting was brutal and close range, with both sides understanding the strategic importance of the battle's outcome. Patton himself arrived at a forward command post on December 23rd to personally oversee the final push to Bastogne. Despite the setbacks and casualties, he remained confident that his armor would break through German lines within hours. The general had staked his reputation and the lives of thousands of soldiers on his ability to relieve McAuliffe's garrison before it was overwhelmed or forced to surrender. Radio communications between 3rd Army headquarters and the trapped paratroopers in Bastogne remained sporadic but critical for coordination. McAuliffe's staff provided intelligence on German positions around the town, while Patton's officers relayed information about the progress of the relief effort. Both commanders understood that time was running out. German attacks on the garrison were intensifying, and casualties were mounting with each passing hour. The weather on December 23rd showed signs of clearing, which meant a light air power might finally be able to support both the relief effort and the defenders of Bastogne. However, it also meant that German forces could more easily observe and target American movements. The race against time had become a race against weather, casualties, and the determination of German forces to eliminate the American garrison before relief could arrive. December 24th, 1944 brought the first clear skies the Ardennes had seen in over a week. The weather front that had protected German forces from Allied air power was finally lifting, revealing a winter landscape transformed by war. Snow-covered fields were cratered by artillery fire, abandoned vehicles littered the roads, and columns of black smoke rose from burning towns throughout the region. For the trapped garrison at Bastogne, this Christmas Eve would determine whether they lived to see another dawn. Inside the besieged town, Brigadier General McAuliffe gathered his staff for what he believed might be their final briefing. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies were exhausted, and food rations had been reduced to barely subsistence levels. German attacks had intensified throughout the night, with Tiger tanks pushing closer to the town center while Wehrmacht infantry infiltrated the defensive perimeter. Radio contact with the outside world remained sporadic, though reports suggested that Patton's relief force was still fighting to break through German lines. The sound of aircraft engines overhead brought both hope and concern to the American defenders. The clearing weather had enabled the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces to launch their first major support missions since the German offensive began. Transport aircraft struggled through anti-aircraft fire to drop desperately needed supplies to the garrison, while fighter bombers attacked German positions around the town's perimeter. Staff Sergeant Garnier led a patrol through the rubble-strewn streets to recover supply bundles that had been dropped outside the defensive perimeter. German snipers and machine gun positions made this incredibly dangerous work, but the supplies were essential for continued resistance. Medical supplies were particularly critical, as wounded soldiers were dying from infections and injuries that would have been treatable under normal circumstances. 10 miles south of Bastogne, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams pressed his armored attack against increasingly desperate German resistance. His tanks had advanced to within 5 miles of the town, but German anti-tank guns and determined infantry were exacting a heavy toll. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost over half its vehicles, and ammunition was running low. Abrams himself had been wounded by shell fragments but refused evacuation, continuing to lead his men from the turret of his Sherman tank. According to military historians and contemporary accounts archived at the United States Military Academy, the breakthrough came at 4 to 5 in the afternoon on December 26th. Major Bogus, commanding a small force of surviving tanks from the 3rd to 7th Battalion, broke through the final German defensive line and established radio contact with the Bastogne garrison. The siege that had lasted 6 days and cost thousands of casualties on both sides was finally broken. The relief of Bastogne represented a turning point not just in the Battle of the Bulge, but in the entire Western European campaign. McAuliffe's garrison had held a critical road junction against overwhelming odds, preventing German armored spearheads from maintaining their momentum toward the Meuse River. Patton's Third Army had accomplished what many considered impossible, redeploying over 100 miles in winter conditions. To mount an effective relief operation, Christmas Day 1944 had been anything but peaceful in the Ardennes, with fighting continuing throughout the holiday. German forces made several desperate attempts to eliminate the Bastogne garrison before relief could arrive, launching tank-supported infantry attacks that were repelled only after fierce hand-to-hand combat. American paratroopers fought from basement to basement, street to street, knowing that surrender meant death or imprisonment for the remainder of the war. The psychological impact of the successful defense extended far beyond the military significance of holding a road junction. American soldiers throughout the European theater understood that their comrades had faced the Wehrmacht's best troops under the worst possible conditions and emerged victorious. The Nuts' response to German surrender demands became a symbol of American determination and fighting spirit. German casualties around Bastogne were staggering, with entire battalions destroyed in repeated attempts to eliminate the garrison. The delay caused by American resistance had allowed Allied forces throughout the Ardennes to reorganize and prepare counterattacks. Hitler's gamble was beginning to fail, not because of superior Allied numbers or equipment, but because of the courage and determination of individual soldiers who refused to surrender. When faced with overwhelming odds as night fell on December 26th, the strategic initiative in the Battle of the Bulge was shifting decisively toward the Allies. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Operation Autumn Mist. Though weeks of brutal fighting still lay ahead before the German offensive would be completely defeated, and the threat to Allied forces in Western Europe finally eliminated. December 27th, 1944 found German forces throughout the Ardennes facing a rapidly deteriorating situation. The relief of Bastogne had not only saved McAuliffe's garrison, but had also demonstrated to the world that the Wehrmacht's final offensive was losing momentum. Clear weather continued to favor Allied air operations, with hundreds of fighter bombers and medium bombers pounding German supply lines, troop concentrations, and armored formations caught in the open. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, met with his army commanders at a forward headquarters near St. Vith on December 28th. The strategic situation was grim and growing worse by the hour. The 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich had been stopped cold by determined American resistance near Elsenburn Ridge, while the 5th Panzer Army's advance had been halted by the defense of Bastogne and Patton's counterattack. Fuel shortages were becoming critical as Allied air attacks destroyed supply convoys attempting to reach the front lines. Major General James Maurice Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division commanded American forces defending the northern shoulder of the German penetration. His paratroopers, supported by elements of the 1st Infantry Division, had established strong defensive positions along Elsenburn Ridge that blocked any German advance toward the vital supply depots at Liege. The fighting in this sector had been particularly brutal, with both sides understanding that breakthrough here could still salvage the German offensive. The weather remained bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit and snow continuing to fall intermittently. Frostbite casualties mounted on both sides as soldiers fought in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, while supply problems affected everything from ammunition to winter clothing. The Battle of the Bulge was becoming as much a fight against the elements as against the enemy. Lieutenant General Courtney Hicks Hodges of the 1st Army coordinated the American defensive effort along the northern and eastern sections of the German penetration. His forces had been caught off guard by the initial German assault, but had recovered quickly to establish strong defensive positions. The key to stopping the German advance had been the speed with which isolated American units had organized defensive strongpoints, disrupting German timetables and allowing reinforcements to arrive. Intelligence reports indicated growing problems within German ranks as the offensive stalled. Fuel shortages had immobilized entire armored formations, while heavy casualties among experienced officers and non-commissioned officers were degrading unit effectiveness. Many German soldiers were beginning to question whether their final offensive could succeed, and morale was declining rapidly as reports filtered back about the relief of Bastogne and successful Allied counterattacks. General Eisenhower visited the front lines on December 29 to assess the situation personally and coordinate the Allied response to the German offensive. The Supreme Allied Commander was accompanied by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder and other senior officers who needed to see firsthand the conditions under which their forces were fighting. The visit demonstrated high-level confidence in ultimate Allied victory while providing encouragement to frontline troops. The German High Command was beginning to recognize that Operation Autumn Mist had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Hitler had hoped to split Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West that would allow Germany to concentrate against Soviet forces advancing from the east. Instead, the offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves without achieving any of these goals, leaving the Reich defenseless against the inevitable Allied spring offensive. American forces began limited counterattacks on December 30th, designed to reduce the German salient and recapture territory lost during the initial assault. These operations required careful coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery units operating in difficult winter conditions. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, but each small victory demonstrated that the strategic initiative had shifted permanently to the Allied side. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was becoming apparent as casualty reports reached higher headquarters. Both sides had suffered terrible losses during the weeks of continuous fighting. In the worst weather conditions of the war, American casualties exceeded 19,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while German losses were estimated at over 25,000. These numbers represented not just military statistics, but individual tragedies affecting families throughout America and Germany. As the year 1944 drew to a close, it was clear that Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed decisively. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, as Allied forces methodically reduced the German salient, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Wehrmacht had shot its bolt, expending its last reserves in a desperate offensive that succeeded only in hastening the end of the Third Reich. January 1st, 1945 brought more than just a new year to the soldiers fighting in the Ardennes. It marked the beginning of the final phase of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive that had begun with such dramatic success on December 16th was now clearly failing, but eliminating the salient created by the initial breakthrough would require weeks of additional fighting. In the harshest winter conditions of the war, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery assumed command of all Allied forces north of the German penetration, while General Omar Bradley retained control of forces to the south. This command arrangement, though creating some tension between American and British leaders, provided better coordination for the complex task of reducing the German salient, while preventing any possibility of renewed German breakthrough attempts. The town of Houffalize became the focal point of Allied counteroffensive operations. This small Belgian community sat at the base of the German salient, and its recapture would effectively cut off German forces still holding advanced positions deeper in Allied territory. Both Patton's Third Army advancing from the south and Hodge's First Army attacking from the north aimed to meet at Houffalize, trapping thousands of German soldiers in a shrinking pocket. Technical Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division led his tank crew through the snow-covered forests approaching Houffalize on January 3rd. The advance was slow and dangerous, with German forces conducting a skilled fighting withdrawal while laying mines and establishing ambush positions. Every village had to be cleared house by house, and every crossroads was defended by anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry determined to delay the Allied advance. The weather continued to hamper operations on both sides, though improved Allied air support was beginning to tell on German forces caught in the open. During daylight hours, Luftwaffe resistance had largely collapsed due to fuel shortages and heavy losses among experienced pilots. American and British fighter bombers now dominated the skies over the battlefield, attacking German supply convoys and troop movements with devastating effectiveness. General von Manteuffel requested permission to withdraw his 5th Panzer Army from its exposed positions, but Hitler initially refused to authorize any retreat. The Führer remained convinced that German forces could hold their gains, and perhaps even resume the offensive toward Antwerp. This strategic stubbornness condemned thousands of German soldiers to death or capture in positions that could no longer be adequately supplied or reinforced. The junction between American forces advancing from north and south occurred on January 16th, when patrols from the 1st and 3rd Armies met east of Hofelize. This linked Allied forces for the first time since the German breakthrough a month earlier, effectively sealing the fate of German units still trapped in the salient. The symbolic importance of this meeting was enormous, demonstrating Allied resilience and the ultimate failure of Hitler's last gamble in the West. Cleanup operations continued throughout the remainder of January, as Allied forces methodically cleared remaining German resistance from the Ardennes region. These final battles were often more brutal than the initial fighting, as desperate German soldiers fought with the fury of men who understood that defeat meant the end of their nation's hopes for survival. Many chose to fight to the death rather than surrender, while others began a long march to prisoner of war camps. The final German withdrawal from the Ardennes was completed by January 28, 1945, exactly 6 weeks after the offensive began. The Battle of the Bulge had cost both sides dearly, but the strategic implications were clear. Germany had expended its last mobile reserves in a failed offensive that accomplished nothing except to hasten the end of the war. American forces had demonstrated remarkable resilience, recovering from initial surprise to defeat the Wehrmacht's final major effort. According to official casualty figures compiled by the Department of the Army, American losses in the Battle of the Bulge totaled over 89,000 killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties exceeded 100,000, including many irreplaceable veteran soldiers and officers whose loss crippled the Wehrmacht's remaining fighting capacity. The human cost of Hitler's gamble had been paid primarily by young men who would never see their homes again. The Battle of the Bulge entered military history as the largest battle fought by American forces during World War II and the bloodiest single engagement in American military history. More importantly, it represented the last major test of American resolve in Europe. The soldiers who fought through that terrible winter of 1944 at 45 had proven that democratic armies could match the determination and fighting skill of totalitarian forces, even under the most adverse conditions imaginable. As spring returned to the Ardennes in 1945, the forests that had witnessed such terrible carnage began to show signs of new life. The scars of battle would remain for decades, but the victory won in those dark winter days had ensured that freedom would ultimately triumph over tyranny in Western Europe. The true story of the Battle of the Bulge was written in the courage of ordinary soldiers who refused to surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. During the harshest winter of the war,